Good morning, everybody. I'm going to do what I've done in the last few live sessions and just wait for a moment just to make sure that people are joining us and that everything's working fine. So bear with me, I'll be starting in a couple of seconds. So hello and welcome to World War I week of Learn with Lorna. I'm back live this week, so the first thing I'm going to do is apologise that I believe a couple of you had some issues with hearing a couple of the episodes before, so apologies for that. Hopefully you can hear this one fine, and the ones that I have pre-recorded for the next few weeks should have no problems with them. So apologies for that, but hopefully this has sorted it now. For those of you joining for the first time, my name is Lorna Steele and I am the Community Engagement Officer at the Highland Archive Service. So my job involves anything at all really that engages people with the collections that we care for. We have a huge range of things across 4 different offices in Inverness, in Wick, in Fort William and in Portree on the Isle of Skye. And so across all of those we hold a really wide range of documents from the 1200s up to the present day. In all of our offices we hold things to do with the First World War. And I came in to my job at the Highland Archive Service in 2014, so a lot of what I've done in my work there has been commemorating the war, because obviously in 2014 we had the centenary celebrations for the outbreak of the First World War, and then each subsequent year we've had things to mark 1915 centenary, 16, 17 and so on. And then obviously a couple of years ago in 2018 we had all the celebrations and commemorations of the end of the First World War. So a lot of my time in the Highland Archive Service has been spent involved with looking at World War I commemorations. So as I often do, I'd like to start just by saying that looking at some of the things in my own family. So World War I, as many of you will know, and again I'm conscious that I'm talking to both adults and young people, so I'll try and find a balance of information and tone, but almost every family, certainly in the UK and across so many countries, was touched by the First World War. Almost every family lost somebody, or lost a neighbour, lost a son, a father, or was affected by the after effects of the war. So I've got a couple of things to show you from my family. So this is some examples of my, what will they be, my great uncles. And you can see there one sailor, there's soldiers and so on in there. But I want to tell you particularly before I start about the Highland records, about one person in my family who served in the First World War who I'm really, really proud of. Now, bear with me because you might not be able to see this very clearly because it's not a real photograph, it's on paper. So, so that is my great-great-grandfather. And his name was Arthur James Steele, and he served in the First World War, and he also served in the Boer War, and if you're with us next week for Victorians then we'll talk a little bit about the Boer War. But he served as a master baker. He started as a staff sergeant in the army, moved through the ranks and got mentioned in dispatches, was awarded the Distinguished Service Medal and a couple of different things. And if you're interested in finding out about somebody from the First World War, those sorts of archives generally are held in London. They're held at the National Archives in Kew, military records. And this is some examples of his records being mentioned in dispatches, his promotions in the army, things like that. But this is the one document I wanted to share with you of my own family because I'm just so proud of it. I'll hold it up just so you can see it, but then I'll read it because you'll not be able to read it from there, I'm sure. And this is a letter that was written in April 1917 about my, what did I say he was? My great-grandfather. I think it's just one great, actually, my great-grandfather. And it says, during the period, now considerably over 2 years, that I have been stationed at this base, the bearer, A.J. Steele, has been employed as a master baker in charge of the bakeries here. His work has been almost phenomenal. Under circumstances of the very greatest difficulty, from the beginning he managed to provide our troops with bread without a hitch or a complaint, always expanding and organising as demands increased by leaps and bounds. He was the soul of the place, and got more loyal support and ungrudging work from his subordinates by his own example and by his tact and kindliness than most men could have got using the strictest of discipline. He was the first man to get the DCM at the army base in France, and received it for sterling merit. Now that he is being taken from us to perform still more important duties elsewhere, I desire to place on record the high appreciation which he is held by every officer with whom he has come into contact, and my own sense of indebtedness for the splendid work he has done since I first knew him. And that was by his commanding officer. So I'm really proud of Arthur. I call him Artie because he was from London, but I don't know if anyone else actually ever called him that, and his wife was called Lillian, so I called him Artie and Lil. So that's Arthur. That's just one story of one person who was taken out of his comfort zone. You know, he had gone into this terrifying situation and did the best he could in a frightening and difficult situation, and that was the case for so many millions of people in the First World War. So I'm going to go on and talk about some of those people who we hold in our records at the Highland Archive Centre and at our other archive centres. But first of all, a little bit of background, because for some people, if you're at school, you might be studying this for the first time and not know some of the basic facts. So the First World War started on the 28th of July, 1914. It came about after an assassination. So that was the killing of somebody called the Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and he was the heir to the throne, to the empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Because he was killed by someone from a different country, this caused a big diplomatic problem, and old alliances and treaties were called up. So across Europe, people started to side with one side or the other. And go, no, we don't agree with that, that shouldn't have happened, yes, this should have happened. And those old alliances and friendships started to build up. And so it ended up the war being between the Allied powers, who were the UK, France and Russia. The UK, obviously at that time, not just being the UK, it was still the remnants of the Empire and the Commonwealth, so lots of other countries. And then the Central powers were on the other side, so that was Germany, Austro-Hungary, Italy, and so that was the two main sides of the war. So as I said, it started on the 28th of July. By the 4th of August, King George V had declared war, so Britain had been pulled into the conflict as well. Immediately, thousands and thousands of Scots volunteered to fight. People wanted to support their country. At that stage, they had no idea the devastation and the bloodshed that the war was going to cause. They thought it was something that would be sorted quite quickly, something that they had a moral duty to stand by the side they believed in. And we'd never been involved. The world had never been involved in a war like that before. So we had no idea what was going to happen and what was going to be involved in that. So lots of people immediately volunteered to fight. The First World War was fought in various different places, not as much as the Second World War, which was fought over a lot more, but the First World War was fought in different places. But the Scottish troops mostly ended up serving in northern France and Belgium, and that was the area called the Western Front. It was a lot of trench warfare. So what that means, and again, if you're at school, you will definitely, if you're doing World War I, you'll go and have a look at some information about trenches and find out about what that. They were dug for protection. So they were the trenches were dug so that soldiers could hide in them, dug into the ground, and then they could put their head up and shoot across to the people on the other side and then duck down again. So they were designed to keep both sides safe, protected. But actually what happened was they ended up being full of water and mud, and people lived there and died there. So often people would have their uniforms cold and wet and with lice in them or rats. They would hear bombs going off all the time, so often soldiers came back with what was called shell shock then, but we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. if you can imagine what it's like to sit in a cold, dark, muddy hole for weeks and weeks on end and see the people that you've grown to rely on and then they get shot next to you, a very traumatic, difficult time. And if any of you have already, adults watching, have already looked at the First World War and know what your connection is, please do tell us in the comments. If you've got family members that you know served in the First World War and anything about their experiences, then do let us know, because it was a huge sacrifice and a huge difficult time for people. So as I said, lots of people volunteered straight away, but by 1916 more people were needed, because the war had been going on for 2 years. People started to realise that it wasn't going to end quickly, and that it was difficult and frightening, and so what was called conscription was introduced, which meant the Military Service Act was passed, which meant that men between the ages of 18 and 41 had to go and serve in the forces. At the beginning that it was 18 to 31, it was only single men, but very quickly that the age range widened, and it widened to married men as well, not women. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the people whose records we hold in the Archive Service who served in the First World War. Some about the people who served, and then a little bit at the end about the Homefront and what that was like here. So first of all, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Ian Forsyth. When you go on, which I hope you will, onto our website at the end of this, you'll see some of the comments, some of the documents that I'm talking about. So Ian Forsyth served in the Seaforth Highlanders. He was a farmer. He was from Rossshire. He had been born in 1877 in Rossshire, and he was in charge of Ballantrad Farm near Invergordon. He was married, and he went off to serve in France. And his letters home to his wife are quite extraordinary. They're really, really emotional and evocative. They really describe what he was seeing. I'm going to just read to you a little extract from one, so forgive me, my eyes are going to go over here because I'm reading something. But he describes to his wife the artillery bombardment, so the bombs and the shells going off, and he says at 7:30 a.m. started the most terrific artillery bombardment of any war. For 10 minutes it was directed on the wire entanglements in front of the German lines at the point where we wanted to break through, and afterwards for 2 hours on various zones and roads behind the German lines. You'll have some idea of what it was like when I tell you that we had 490 guns in action, and including one 9-inch gun throwing a shell of a ton each time, commonly known as Mother. It was the most exhilarating thing I have experienced. Each gun seemed to have a note of its own, and the whole thing blended into a magnificent overture that was 100 times finer than the 1812 overture. If any of you are able to, after this, go and have a listen to the 1812 overture if you're not familiar with it. It was written to mark a war and a battle, and there's cannon fire through it. So it's a great piece of music that gives you an idea of the noise and the bombardment. But his letters are interesting because for someone running a farm in Invergordon to go somewhere so totally different and hear all these noises and this chaos of noise was just so different from what he'd experienced before. His wife had a child when he was away, so he didn't get to meet her, but he did get back, and he survived the war and carried on farming that land, and was probably different for what he had seen. So that's Ian Forsyth, and as I say, there's some of his letters for you to have a look at on the website. The next people I want to tell you about are called Alan and Donald Cameron, and they were two brothers from Lochaber. They were the sons of Cameron of Lochiel. They both went out to fight early in the war, and one survived and one didn't. Donald survived, and we have a lot of his letters written back to his wife describing the war, describing what was happening. And And Alan didn't survive. So Alan went out and served in the Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and he went out with the British Expeditionary Force to France, and they were the first, or some of the very first people to go to France to fight. We have quite a lot of his papers. We've got, and interesting ones, as well as letters. We have a list of all his kit that he took with him. We have a map that he drew of the trenches that he served in, and letters and things back to his wife. As I say, he went very early in the First World War with the British Expeditionary Forces, went to France, but he was killed in September, on the 26th of September 1914, and he was only 34 years old, and he died when his regimental headquarters were bombed and completely destroyed. And some of the letters that we have to do with him are really interesting and lovely. We have a letter written back to his wife from someone who was there, who said, I'm going to describe to you what happened and how Alan died. And it describes how proud they all are of the fact, and he said, you must be so proud that he's given his life for this country and for a cause that we all believe in so much. I've always read that and wondered whether his wife Hester did go, yes, I'm so proud, what a great thing to happen. You know, it must have been a huge, painful moment for her that she must have dreaded might happen. But maybe after a little while there was a sense of pride that he had served his country and had died serving the cause that everybody believed in. One of Donald's letters, his brother, writing home to his wife, said, I've seen a report in the newspapers that maybe Alan is still alive. I'm going to check it out, but I think it's not true. And he says, I really hope his wife doesn't see this and get the false hope that maybe Alan's alive and then discover that he's not. So that's an interesting story and an example of what would have happened to a lot of people in the First World War, where one would have survived and the other one didn't. David Barrigal Keith is another person I'm just going to tell you about. He's the last one I want to tell you about before I go and talk a little bit about the Homefront in the First World War. So David Barrigal Keith was born in 1891 in Caithness. He went to Miller Academy in Thurso and then went to Edinburgh University, where he trained in law and he qualified as a solicitor in 1914. So he just qualified as a solicitor as the war broke out. He immediately enlisted, was commissioned to serve in the Cameronians, and he served in France from 1915 to 1917. The reason we've picked David Barrigal Keith to tell you about is because he was also an artist. He was a solicitor, but he was also an artist. And if you Google him at any point, you'll see that he continued to be an artist, and his pictures are for sale. And he drew loads of cartoons during the First World War. He wrote letters home, but he also drew loads of pictures of different people he served alongside. And so you can see, when you go onto our website, some of those caricatures that he'd drawn of different people that he served with. I think quite often commanding officers were on the receiving end of that. His sister Christina was also a really interesting character. She went on, studied, became one of the very early people to go to early women to go to university and study, and she ended up going out to France at the end of the First World War to lecture to the troops. So she was one of the first people, one of the first women to arrive, and when the war finished, to walk across all these devastated battlefields and see what had happened there. They both came back fine. They both survived. David Barrigal Keith lived into his 80s, so I think it was in the 1970s that he died. I would need to do my maths a bit better, but he lived until his 80s in all sorts of different roles and in different places. But I think his heart was always in Caithness, and his pictures often are of Caithness area. So that's just a few examples. When you think the war ended in obviously the 11th of November 1918 with the armistice, and the Allied forces had won, so the UK had been on the winning side, but a rough estimate, 20 million people had died. about 75 to 150,000 of those were Scots. But it's quite extraordinary when you think that every one of them had a story in the way that Alan or Donald or David or all of those people I've talked about have that story of what happened to them. The same was true for all of those 20 million people, and so many wives, mothers, children had that relationship broken or damaged because of what happened in the war. So that's the war front. For the last 5 or 10 minutes, I want to just chat a little bit about some of the things that happened on the home front. The biggest thing to tell you about, because it's just so strikingly similar to what's happening just now, is the Defence of the Realm Act, commonly known as DORA. What that meant was it was very, very quickly passed. So as soon as war was declared, there was an emergency piece of legislation, emergency law passed to say that the government could basically not do whatever they want, but the government could take a lot of decisions very quickly without going through the normal processes, because it was a state of national emergency and they needed decisions to be made quickly and not through going through committees and discussions and revisions and things. And so the Defence of the Realm Act is responsible for a huge amount of things that happened in the First World War on the home front. Some of them were big, important things, like censorship of the press, so you weren't allowed to report negative stories home from the war front because they wanted to keep morale up at home, make them think that it was going okay. They could requisition buildings, which meant they could take over whatever they wanted, take over hospitals or hotels to use them for whatever purposes they needed. One of the big ones, which we talked about in the Second World War week, but was the same for First World War, was the Special Military Area was passed, which meant that the area, pretty much area north of the Caledonian Canal, was used as a special military area, which meant that people needed to have passes and passports to travel within that area because it was deemed to be of high importance in a military sense. And so if you wanted to travel in, you needed to show your passport to the police and say, I'm entitled to be visiting the Highlands. There's a great newspaper headline from the day it came in that just says the Highlands is closed, which again is kind of similar to what we're seeing at the moment with the Highlands is closed because of the virus. So there's some really big things that were passed in the Defence of the Realm Act. There were also some other things, like you weren't allowed to buy any drinks for anybody else because they didn't want, it was called treating, and they didn't want the morale to drop. They didn't want people to start drinking and then be late for work, and they just wanted everybody to be contributing to the war effort. You weren't allowed binoculars in case you were spying off the coast. You weren't allowed bonfires or fireworks, and this is my absolute favourite one, you weren't allowed to write abroad with invisible ink. I can't imagine there were hundreds of people doing that before, but anyway, you weren't allowed to write abroad with invisible ink in case you were giving secrets away to the enemies. You also weren't allowed to draw near the coast in case you were drawing locations of ships or the coastline. So all sorts of things covered by the Defence of the Realm Act. Really interesting piece of law. Things changed for school children as well. So obviously a huge number of men were called away to fight, and so a lot of school children got called to work on the land, which they had done anyway, but a lot more. And there's some examples of that on the website for you to look at as well, and children being asked to gather moss to send out to be used as dressings for wounds. One school logbook from Merkinch Primary in Inverness shows the American naval base being set up in Inverness, and all the children, it says they're all pressed up at the window watching the American troops. They can't get them to get any work done because they're all watching American sailors. So those sorts of things happened. And one particularly horrible, I think I can say for quite a lot of us that work at the archives, it's one of the documents that makes you go, oh no, that's horrible, is an extract from a school logbook in Nairn, Millbank Primary, and it says the older boys, this is sort of 1917, 18, as the war goes on and on, it says the older boys now are starting to be given military drill. So it's almost like they're saying, we're going to need more. We're going to need more people to fight, so let's start training them up now. I don't know if that's what that was, or if that was just to do with fitness, but it feels like it's preparing the next lot to go out and fight. Obviously things changed on the work front as well, so lots of businesses changed what they were doing. Famous one from a Highland point of view is the Rose Street Foundry, and again that storyboard is up on our website for you to look at. They had been iron manufacturers and welders, and immediately in the run-up to the war being declared, they had a telegram from the Admiralty saying, the minute we ask you for anything, you drop everything else and you need to make things for the Admiralty, for the Army, for the Navy. And they manufactured and designed boom defences, which went out round the coasts to prevent submarines getting in, and that was done in Inverness. And they also employed women munitions workers to make mine sinkers, and you can see that picture on our website as well. Obviously women played a big role in the First World War as nurses, as munitions workers, things like that. And there's a lot of talk about how much that contributed to women getting the vote in 1918. That's a whole interesting other subject. But as I say, the war ended on the 11th of November 1918 with the armistice. The Allied forces had won, as I said, but so many lives had been lost. And even for those that came home, and my great-granddad Arthur came home, I can't imagine life was ever the same for them after what they'd been through. So it's just something to think about with that number of 20 million, or that the estimate changes, but that number is just so huge that you can't really get your head around it when you think of how many lives had been shattered or changed or lost or affected by that. So I'm going to stop talking about World War I. It's such a huge subject to cover. There's so much more I could have said, but hopefully that gives you a little bit of an insight into some of the records that we hold to do with the First World War. Let us know if you're enjoying the talks, if you have any thoughts or any information for us. And thank you, just before I go, to those of you who've sent in things. I've had people sending in things to do with their memories of VE Day after the World War II talk I did. And it's really lovely for us to know that these talks are getting to you and that you're interested and that they're prompting memories and conversations, and I've seen some great things that people are working on in their families as well. So do let us know if you're doing anything. We've got a hashtag HLHLearn with Lorna if you want to share anything with us with that, or send it in to us. Next week I won't be live, but the talk will be going out as normal, so hopefully it will all go without a hitch. I've got every confidence. And next week will be Victorians. We'll be looking at the Boer War, some of the inventions that came about in the Victorian era, and how we saw the start of the welfare state in the Victorian era. So I hope you can join us next Thursday. Take care of yourselves until we see you again.